We've been working on scholarly skepticism, and this is the 8th lecture in our series. Just a brief recap of what's going on with scholarly skepticism. It is centered in Germany and spreads outward from there. It's influenced in its first phase very heavily by Hume and other deists, but relatively little by Hegel. That's not to say that the individual contributors are not influenced by Hegel, but that their contributions show less influence of Hegel than those of the Tübingen school, and we'll be seeing that in more detail in the final week of the course. The kind of skepticism that we're dealing with is rooted in writers like Reimarus and Lessing, but it comes to full flower in Strauss and Renan. We dealt with Strauss's Life of Jesus last lecture. This time we're going to look at it from the standpoint of what happened after Strauss's Life of Jesus was published, and also try to frame that in terms of some other work that has bearing on the subject. To get a view from a height here, I'd like to back out for a minute and look at the Orthodox Christian argument as it was put forward by people like Philip Doddridge in the middle of the 18th century. It ran something like this. They didn't formulate it in a deductive form, but I think this is a faithful reconstruction. Either Jesus' first followers told the truth, or they did not. If they did not, then either they knew that what they were saying was false, or they did not know that it was false. If they knew it was false, then they were deceivers. If they did not know that it was false, they were deceived. But they were not deceivers. Their lives give evidence of their sincerity, and they were not deceived. The events are the kinds of things about which the original witnesses could not have been mistaken. Therefore, Christianity is true in all of its miraculous elements. Now, this kind of argument has a beautiful flow to it, but in effect what Strauss did was to say there is a missing premise in the argument, and the missing premise is false. The missing premise is that Jesus' first followers told the same stories we find in the Gospels. To undermine that claim, Strauss argues that the Gospels were not written until several generations later, well up into the 2nd century. During the intervening century, a body of miracle stories grew up around Jesus. This is what he calls a mythos. By the time these stories were finally written down, there was no one living who could compare them with the non-miraculous events that actually took place. There were no living eyewitnesses. There were, in all probability, not even any people living who had spoken to living eyewitnesses. So the whole thing was beyond the reach of the kind of evidence that they would have had available had the stories been told closer to the time. In fact, Strauss says in his Life of Jesus that the idea that any of the Gospels were written by the people whose names they bear, by original followers of Jesus or their immediate companions, is fatal to his theory, and he therefore absolutely must dissociate the Gospels from their traditional authors. Finally, we come here to a kind of methodological issue. Strauss has resolved the question of special divine action into the question of the dating and authorship of the Gospels. If the traditional dating and authorship can be maintained, then Strauss's theory is in dire straits. He's forced to a very difficult position. If that traditional authorship and dating is completely wrong, off by the better part of a century, then Strauss says there's room for myth to grow, and myth requires time. Strauss would not for a moment countenance the idea that myth could supplant the true story, as in his view, the non-miraculous story, within a very short period of time. You couldn't do this within living memory. You would have to have this arise gradually and not deliberately, just sort of accidentally, over the course of a long period of time. Here are Strauss's principal contentions, both in his original Life of Jesus and in his subsequent work. Any report of the supernatural, of prophecy or miracles in particular, may be set aside at once as unhistorical. It does pose a question to us, but the question is not whether it's true. The question is, how did this story arise? And we may exert our ingenuity to try to determine how it arose. Any contradictions between two narratives demonstrate that at least one of them is false. If they are otherwise equally well attested, then we've got a contradiction between two things and we don't know where to lay the blame. That casts doubt on both of them. we're in a position of not knowing what we can trust. A very important additional point, the silence of one author, when we should have expected him to take notice of a fact or event, is equivalent to a denial. This free use of the argument from silence is hugely important. Strauss does say early on in sections of the life of Jesus that I had you read that the mere silence of an author by itself is of very little consequence. However, he goes on to say that when we would have expected that author to mention something and he doesn't, then the argument from silence becomes very valuable. As it happens, Strauss has almost never met an argument from silence he didn't like. Every time he comes across a place where one author is silent, he immediately tells us that we should have assumed that author would say something about this had the author known about the event. And as the author could not have failed to know about it, his silence is equivalent to a denial. So although he says something methodologically modest at the outset, he then never returns to that, never backs down from an argument from silence. A fourth methodological contention is that we can explain how a narrative took shape by finding parallels between its parts and older literature to which the authors had access. So when we look at a narrative like the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist and his life, we can find bits and pieces that correspond to this in the Old Testament. Oh, Zecharias, his wife's name is Elizabeth. Well, according to the Septuagint, that was also the name of Aaron's wife. So there we go. We've explained Elizabeth. John is raised in a peculiar way with a peculiar vow. Well, hey, that might have come from the story of Samson. So we find these bits and pieces, and it's very curious to think what must be going through the mind of someone who's composing such a story. There is a long history of people trying to write novels by stealing ideas from other people's novels. But this really takes the cake. This would be such a spectacular example of the cut and paste school of composition that the only way that Strauss can secure the authors from the charge of really just being plagiarizers is to say that they did not intend to plagiarize. Their minds were just so full of these bits and pieces that they came to them naturally. And as we asked last time, how could any history be secured from being dissolved by this means? If this counts as an explanation, what is there that cannot be explained away? Finally, Strauss's position in his early work is that the heart of Christianity is a kind of pantheism, purely non-supernatural, but still involving something that is worthy of reverence that is not simply the material universe. That's Strauss's position, and those are his principal tools in his life of Jesus. Now we turn to his later work. First, he wrote a series of polemical pieces against people who criticized his life of Jesus. So 2 years later, there had been a firestorm of controversy. Neander and Lange and others had written responses. And so in his Streitschriften, he gives us responses specifically to the people who had criticized his life of Jesus. He's merciless. He makes not the slightest concession to courtesy with any of them. This is all-out war from his perspective. Meanwhile, he was working on a 2-volume work on Christian doctrine. Christliche Glaubslehre, I believe. And this is an attempt to account for Christian doctrine on Hegelian lines. Strauss had come to study under Hegel and Schleiermacher in 1831, but Schleiermacher was the only one whose lectures he could attend because Hegel, inconveniently enough, died in 1831. So Strauss arrived just after his death. He went to Schleiermacher's lectures on the life of Jesus, but the Hegelian influence is stronger in his Christian doctrine. Here and later, he attempts to account for the growth of Christian doctrine by the typical Hegelian device of thesis and antithesis, and then a synthesis of the two. And the original thesis and antithesis were Jewish Christianity represented in the school that centered on Peter, and James, and Pauline Christianity, centered around the character of Paul. These two were in conflict. The conflict worked out a new compromise, and then gradually, over time, Strauss says the doctrine sort of fell apart. So he has a negative view of the historical trajectory of doctrine, but the driving engine of it is a Hegelian dialectic. This will be worked out much more thoroughgoingly in the writers who comprise people like Bauer and Hilgenfeld and Volkmar, the Tübingen school writers. Their signature item will be the absolutely thoroughgoing application of a Hegelian dialectic. But we see a bit of it coming out here in Strauss. In 1860, he took some time off. Between 1841 and 1862, you'll see there are no theological writings. He wrote a series of biographies that were critically well received. In 1862, he wrote a biography of Reimarus, whose work we looked at earlier when we were talking about the history leading up to Strauss. In 1864, he wrote A New Life of Jesus for the German People. This is a work that was not directed to the scholars. He had written his original Life of Jesus in 1835 for the scholarly world and was surprised and a bit dismayed that it was taken up by the popular audience, the populace, and was not considered to be a work of scholarship, but rather just a crude attack on the popular belief. It had been intended only for the scholars. Now he says, forget that. I'm going to write straight for the German people, and we'll look a bit at that as we move forward. And then in 1872, right near the end of his life, he wrote a book called The Old Faith and the New. And very significantly, the subtitle of that work was A Confession. And we'll see what Strauss is confessing when we get to that. So what is it in his New Life of Jesus that we can find? Well, first of all, here, unlike his Leben Jesu, his Life of Jesus from 1835, he explicitly names David Hume. And here's a quotation from A New Life of Jesus. On the side of the skeptical and critical philosophers, Hume's essay on miracles in particular carries with it such general conviction that the question may be regarded as having been by it virtually settled. And again, on the same page, he recapitulates Hume's argument in a way that leaves no doubt that this really was the driving engine behind his anti-supernaturalism. In our own minds, we should balance the two probabilities, considering which was the greater, that a witness apparently the most credible should nevertheless have deceived us, or that an event should have happened contradicting all previous experience. There are examples of testimony, even the most credible, given by eyewitnesses, by honest men and so forth, having been false. These instances may be rare, but still there have been such. But with the exception of the cases where credibility is in question, there are no instances of events demonstrably contradicting the laws of nature. So there it is. It's an arm wrestling contest between testimony and the laws of nature. And as Hume put it, the laws of nature have unexceptionable testimony. They are supported by an argument from experience as strong as can possibly be imagined. No argument could be stronger. Of course, they're not going to lose if we put them up in a contest against testimony. Testimony, even taken at its best, even of honest and credible witnesses, and so forth. So it's very clear that for Strauss there is no new discovery per se, no special new line of philosophical argument, no piece of evidence that convinces him of this. It is David Hume's influence coming out. So this is a very important concession or admission on his part. He's punting to Hume, and he does not offer any further defense of this. So that's a very important reference. If you're writing anything about Strauss, this is a very important place to go. When he moves to the Old Faith and the New 8 years later, he puts the choice much more starkly. Pantheism no longer interests him. The choice lies between atheistic Darwinism or supernatural Christianity. And he writes in a way that calls to mind Richard Dawkins' comment in The Blind Watchmaker that although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. This work shows just how thoroughly Strauss had been captivated by Darwin's idea and how he had taken it further than Darwin himself. He acknowledges that Darwin stops short at the origin of life, but he himself has no such qualms. He thinks eventually we'll just push it all the way through and have the simplest living things arising out of non-living matter. We'll have abiogenesis. That will be the end of the whole discussion. He mentions Darwin perhaps 36 times throughout the work, whereas Darwin just hadn't come up before. Darwin's Origin of Species, of course, very famous work, was published in English in 1859. So it took a little while to get through to Strauss, but when it did, it provided for him the key that made him see that atheism was now the logical end of the road. Miracles, of course, cannot be admitted, but now our treatment of Jesus changes. Jesus had before been treated by Strauss as the highest religious genius of the race. He was a moral example. His consciousness was pure. Now Strauss has demoted Jesus. We, that is critical scholars who agree with Strauss, are no longer Christians, he says. And insofar as we have a religion, it's simply a feeling of dependence on the universe. Jesus was a dreamy fanatic. It was all just a baseless fabric of a vision. It can all be discarded. So those who had looked to Strauss to provide them with what Matthew Arnold wanted, a way of retaining a warm feeling toward the eternal not ourselves that makes for righteousness, found that at the end Strauss himself had given that up and offered them nothing more than materialism in a very straightforward form. As Renan came after Strauss's Life of Jesus and wrote his own Life of Jesus just the year before Strauss's New Life of Jesus, published in French in 1863, translated immediately into English. And Renan is an interesting character. As a master of Oriental languages, he had studied for the Catholic priesthood, but abandoned that vocation. He traveled in the Holy Land and said that as he walked through Tyre and Sidon and Galilee, he found here before him a fifth gospel. And in the light of that fifth gospel, he interpreted the four canonical gospels, seeing it as a drama played out on a stage that he himself could walk on. So his Life of Jesus is a literary production of very great literary merit. As a stylist, Renan is justly famous. Here are the main principles of his thought. I'm quoting here from his studies in the history of religion. He says, criticism has two modes of attacking a marvelous narrative. For as to accepting it as it stands, it cannot think of it, since its essence is denial of the supernatural. You cannot accept a supernatural account. This particular essay, from which I am quoting, was originally written and published in a journal called The Freedom of Thought, La Liberté de Penser, but it's republished here. And then he has a footnote so that you don't miss what he means. He says, by supernatural, I mean here miraculous, that is to say, the special intervention of deity in the physical and psychological order of the world, deranging the course of events with a view to particular government of humanity. That doesn't happen. The essence of criticism is denial of the supernatural. Again, later in his studies, not from one line of reasoning, but from the whole mass of modern sciences comes this immense result. Nothing is supernatural. There's nothing supernatural. This is not a point that Renan argues. It is the starting point. These principles shape his work, but he declines to offer any defense for them. His work is written for people who are enlightened, as he is enlightened, who see what he sees. Curiously, Renan concedes that the Gospels are substantially the work of their traditional authors. Most curiously, he says that although the Gospel of John has in some places been interpolated, still there's a great deal of material that goes right back to John himself. Now, he thinks that John is confused, deranged, and has put some things in there that we simply can't believe. But he is moved, in part just by the sheer external evidence for authorship, to acknowledge the traditional authorship of this gospel. The miracle stories in the Gospels are legends. Strauss calls them myths, but Renan says they are actually more stories that grew up in the telling around a core of actual eyewitness testimony to the mundane events in the life of Jesus. And those things were written earlier than Strauss had wanted to concede. Still, the substantive negative conclusions of Strauss, no miracles occur, many of these things are contradictory, Renan accepts without demur. Not so much arguing for them, not even recapitulating Strauss's arguments, but again, just assuming them and then moving forward from that assumed position. You may have wondered, as we were taking so much time focusing on people like Lessing, Reimarus, Strauss, Paulus, and Renan, what was going on the other side of the argument? And here there are a few things. I've mentioned several times Richard Whately, the Anglican logician at Oxford, theologian, Archbishop of Dublin. Whately wrote a book called Historic Doubts Relative to Napoleon Bonaparte, and I've mentioned this before. He wrote it in 1819, published while Napoleon was still alive, and imprisoned, I believe, on St. Helena. It's a satiric application of Hume's skepticism. Obviously, writing in 1819, Whately cannot be attempting to respond to Strauss, but since Strauss's line of attack depends so heavily on finding incredibilities and discrepancies in narratives, and then saying that on that basis we must discard them, Whately's critique is actually very timely with regard to Strauss, because it attacks the fundamental principles from which Strauss's critique springs. So he has no difficulty showing that there are many absolutely incredible things reported of Napoleon, that these are the kinds of things that are unprecedented in human affairs, that we would not credit them under ordinary circumstances, and he weaves a fanciful tale of how the British government decided that the French would be a good target if only they could encourage Englishmen to hate the French in one particular person personified. That would increase national unity, and so they invented someone to play the good part, the Bonaparte, of being the antagonist to the English people, ultimately vanquished, of course, by English valor. So by such means, and making free use of moves that will be remarkably similar to those Strauss uses, he manages to dissolve the entire history of Napoleon into a fable. This is quite an interesting work, was enormously popular, but it's written in a popular way. It's not a contribution to scholarship. Whately was more than capable of doing that, but this is not what he was trying to do here. He really started a genre of theological satire on the orthodox side. There are several other satires of this kind. Charles Hudson's Doubts Concerning the Battle of Bunker's Hill was one on the American side. Oliver Price Buell in the 1890s, responding to the kind of skepticism that T.H. Huxley had picked up from the Tübingen School, wrote a work called The Abraham Lincoln Myth. Again, very much a satire in the vein of Whately's satire. So it spawned a little genre of such things. And then there are pieces elsewhere. In John Relly Beard's Voices of the Church, someone tries to dissolve the life of Martin Luther in the same way that Strauss has dissolved the life of Jesus. other authors. I can give you more if you're interested in pursuing this. This whole vein of satire as a theological polemical weapon really got started with Whately's work and was later applied very self-consciously to the results of Strauss and other German critics and their English followers. Another book appeared rather quietly in 1833 and then went through many subsequent editions. This is by John James Blunt, and it's a work called Undesigned Coincidences. Originally, it arose as a set of lectures that Blunt had given, and then was bundled together with more work and went through many editions. You see here a copy of the title page of the 9th edition. Blunt's contention is that the historical narratives of the Gospels, and in many cases of the Old Testament as well, interlock in ways that strongly indicate they were written by authors who were well-informed and habitually truthful. The way the argument works is not by showing passages that tell the same story in the same words, but rather by showing passages where typically one passage of a narrative will raise a question that that book does not answer. But if you appeal to a different narrative written by a different author, perhaps with a different purpose, you find incidentally the clue that unlocks the argument there. So this is a mode of argument that William Paley had traced out with regard to the book of Acts on the one hand and the epistles of Paul on the other, showing interconnections among them. It was the work of Blunt to extend that argument across a wider surface area, and in particular to pioneer it with regard to the Gospels. Another figure, a very interesting figure that is worth our time thinking about is George John Romanes. Romanes was a Canadian-born English evolutionary biologist. When he went to university, he actually wrote an essay that won a prize for apologetics. It was an essay on prayer and the law-like governance of the universe. How could prayer be of any effect if the universe is governed wholly by natural laws? But at the same time that he received that prize, he was in the process of losing his faith and became an agnostic. He actually wrote a little book which he circulated anonymously. It had just the pseudonym Physicus for the author, called A Candid Examination of Theism. And in that book he comes to a resolutely agnostic position, not atheism, but agnosticism. We just can't know. His work in evolutionary biology attracted the attention of Charles Darwin, and the two became quite close. Darwin actually asked for Romanes' advice and criticism on things he had not yet published. He was, I think, very clearly Darwin's youngest and perhaps most beloved protege. When Darwin died, Romanes grieved more than he had grieved for the death of his own father. Near the end of his life, Romanes actually reconsidered his doubts, and he reconverted to Christianity, persuaded in part by the work of scholars like Westcott and Lightfoot. We'll be looking at them in the final week of this course. But their work came to him through the medium of some of his friends, Canon Scott Holland and Bishop Gore, and he realized that something had been wrong with his agnosticism. It had not been pure enough, he said, and he needed to retrench. So in the last 2 months of his life, while he was suffering with a debilitating brain tumor, probably, he began working on a manuscript, and he said at one point to his wife, "If I die before I finish this, give it to Gore, he'll know what to do with it." And he did die before he completed it, so Charles Gore was handed the scattered notes and put together as many of them as he could, and published it the year after Romanes' death as Thoughts on Religion. It's quite a fascinating window on the mind of someone who lost his faith and then found his way back, and was trying to leave an account of how he found his way back at the time of his death. In some ways, of course, that parallels what we already saw about Thomas Cooper, but Cooper's way back came 30 years and more before his death, and so he had 30 years to be very explicit and give many, many lectures and sermons explaining why he now rejected the arguments of Strauss that had once bound him fast, as he put it. But in Romani's case, this is someone who's not a self-educated polymath, but rather a celebrated evolutionary biologist. So it's quite fascinating. He never saw any contradiction between his Darwinism and his recovered Christianity. So it's not that he recanted his Darwinism or anything like that. It is that he felt that he had been led not to take a serious look at the evidence for the miraculous. So he specifically comes back to that. There are many other responses to Strauss and Renan. So instead of trying to give you a coverage of them one by one, which would take us far too long, I simply want to give you a list of some of these. If these issues interest you, these are places to go, and I've put them in rough chronological order. Henry Rogers was an English clergyman who wrote a book called Reason and Faith, Their Claims and Conflicts. Second edition of that came out in 1850. In an appendix, he gives what he calls a general character of Dr. Strauss's life of Jesus. So as you can see, that fills about 30 pages of the appendix to his work. It's a short book, but that's a good place to go to look for an early English reaction. Another work that you want to look at would be Christ and Christianity, a vindication of the divine authority of the Christian religion, an express piece of advocacy, but chapter 5 is devoted directly to Strauss's life of Jesus. John Fletcher Hurst was a bibliographer and wrote a history of rationalism embracing a survey of the present state of Protestant theology. Chapter 11 talks about the reaction produced by Strauss's life of Jesus. That's another good source if this is a topic that interests you. Philip Schaff, the noted church historian, who's got the many-volume history of the church, has a book, The Person of Christ, the Miracle of History, with a reply to Strauss and Renan. So, as you can see by the date, Renan had written in 1863. By 1866, Schaff was out with a response. There's a peculiarity about Schaff's response, which is that he's adopted Bushnell's conception of a miracle. If you look at pages 157 through 59, you'll see that. That puts him on a slightly different track from many of the Orthodox responders to Strauss. So again, if this interests you, there's a possible source to go to. A popular level response to Strauss. The truth of the evangelical history of our Lord Jesus Christ proved in opposition to Dr. D.F. Strauss, the chief of modern disbelievers in Revelation. It came out in 1856. At the same time, translated from the German, August Neander's Life of Jesus in its historical connection and historical development. It's a far more scholarly piece of work written by one of Strauss's German peers. Neander was widely recognized as a very great scholar, and although he is not particularly conservative in his outlook, he certainly thinks that Strauss has gone much too far and opposes him at many points and quite explicitly. George Park Fisher was an American scholar teaching at Yale, where he held a position as professor of church history. He's got a work that came out in multiple editions. I've got the link here to the third edition, Essays on the Supernatural Origin of Christianity. And as you can see from the subtitle, the theories of Renan, Strauss, and the Tübingen School get special attention. Fisher is fairly conservative. He was a friend of B.B. Warfield, though he disagreed with Warfield's view of inspiration. He's a good example of a late 19th century American scholar who takes a conservative view, but is not willing to stake his life on a particular theory of inspiration, certainly would not have signed the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, but a very thorough scholar and very interesting, very much worth reading. Charles Adolphus Rowe was an English scholar, prebend of St. Paul's Cathedral. In a course of lectures delivered at the request of the Christian Evidence Society, he's got one called Mythical Theories of Christianity. Rowe directly addresses Strauss there, and he's also got some other works that might interest you, and you can look these up in our library as the mood takes you. So remember the name of Rowe if you're interested in that. And finally, Franz Ludwig Steinmeier, The History of the Passion and Resurrection of Our Lord, considered in the light of modern criticism, is also an engagement with this particular strand of German skepticism and scholarly skepticism that comes out most clearly in Strauss and Renan.